year-old killing a cop, landing himself on death row.
They call it a procedure, like it's just paperwork with a pulse. A door opens, a man steps through, and suddenly every second has edges. Metal, keys, shoes that echo too loudly. 60 slow steps from a holding cell to a room designed to convince everyone, guards, witnesses, even the man on the bed, that this is order, not finality. I used to think the argument ended there. I was certain I could never agree with state-sanctioned death, but then I listened to men who did things most people can't even let their minds picture, and the certainty I wore like armor started to rattle. Indiana State Prison sits on the lakeshore like a fortress pretending to be a factory. Brick wire, cold winters, colder routines. For years people said the death house was a museum piece, a place we talked about in the past tense. In 2009, a man named Matthew Eric Wrinkles walked that corridor and never walked back. And for a long time the clock there seemed to stop. Then, after a 15-year pause, the clock started again. Another name. Another midnight. Another room where a heartbeat and the law meet and only one of them leaves. And that's where our story begins. In a world where time doesn't just pass, it counts down. Context. Wrinkles in 2009, Indiana resumed executions but the world behind those walls isn't all headlines and last words. It's long hours and short tempers, jokes traded through steel, a routine built to keep the peace in a place where almost everyone remembers the worst minute of their life in perfect detail. Imagine waking up to the same view for a decade, 20 years, more. You learn the rhythm, 23 hours in, 1 hour out. You learn the sounds, a TV muffled by concrete, a weight bench thudding, a pen scratching letters to someone who still answers. You learn how to shrink your life to a space the size of a small room and then somehow expand it again so you can breathe.
She's like my kid. I've raised her since she was a little bitty kitten. And I love her like she's my kid.
There's a man who knows every angle of that death chamber hallway because it's his job to walk it with others. He doesn't talk like a villain. He talks like a man who carries a heavy box carefully because if he drops it, people will get hurt. He learns the names. He listens. He keeps the rules. He tells himself, and anyone who asks, that it isn't about him or his beliefs. He enforces what the law decides. He's there to make sure something terrifying looks like a process. And for the men waiting, that might be the cruelest kindness of all, to turn the end of a life into a schedule. You may have seen the interviews. A journalist sits on a plastic chair. A man in a khaki uniform says he isn't going to sugarcoat anything. He tells the story in a flat voice, because if he lets feeling in, he might break apart. He says he did it. He says the law says he deserves what's coming. He says time is running out. And then he talks about ordinary things, like a girlfriend who lives far away and what she might be cooking right now. He talks about writing letters, about the weights he'll lift if the rec pen opens, about the calendar where he writes down birthdays of people he can never meet again. You can hear the dissonance buzzing between every word. Monsters don't talk like this. Men do. That's the trap for anyone watching. You want it simple. You want a bright red line between them and us. But the longer you sit in that room, the harder it is to pretend that line isn't drawn in pencil. The system wants clean endings. The people inside it live messy middles. One inmate cuts hair with care, as if a good fade could steady a life that derailed years ago. Another cradles a cat like a lifeline. In this place, compassion has whiskers and purrs. A third guy swears he'll never be anything but a thief, says it like a fact of nature, like gravity. And over all of it hangs the knowledge that some of these men have a date, written in ink, and others only have a question mark. If you're expecting me to preach, you'll be disappointed. I'm not here to sell you a stance. I'm here to show you a place where certainty goes to be tested. It's easy to oppose the death penalty from a distance.
I've been a thief all my life. That's all I've been. That's all I've ever been. I'm not proud of that fact, but
it's easy to demand it when you hear the wrong kind of story. It's much harder to stand in a corridor that smells like disinfectant and dust, look through a window at a man strapped to a bed, and say out loud to yourself that you know exactly what justice is. Because justice in here doesn't feel like a straight line. It feels like a weight you have to hold without dropping, even when your hands are shaking. There's another layer, the one few people talk about. The way the machine of law keeps turning while human beings try to sleep. Appeals stack like paper snowdrifts. Judges write in careful language that never says I can't stop thinking about this. Years pass, hair grays. People die on the outside while someone waits on the inside. Agonizingly, cases shift. A sentence imposed, then challenged, then switched. Some men who once expected a final walk find themselves staring at a different horizon, not freedom, but life without end. It's not mercy the way movies paint it, it's something murkier. A decision that says, you will not face the needle, but you will face tomorrow, and the next tomorrow, and the next. So why start here? Because this corridor, this procedure, isn't just the end of a story, it's a mirror turned on all of us. What do we believe punishment is for? What do we choose when rage and grief demand a price? What do we owe to the memory of people who can't speak anymore? And what do we owe to the truth that even the worst among us are still stubbornly human? Tonight, we open the door and take the first step down that hallway. We'll meet the people who walk it. Some by choice, some by order, some because there's nowhere else to go. We'll see how a place built for certainty became the most complicated question in American justice. And we'll ask the only question that matters when the clock starts again. What exactly does it mean to be done? But that wasn't the whole story. The ritual you've just pictured, the keys, the cuffs, the final words, exists inside a world that runs on routines, compromises, and tiny acts of survival. In part 2, we step into that world and watch how the system keeps breathing when everyone inside is holding theirs. Morning starts before the sun figures out what to do with itself. A buzzer hums somewhere deep in the concrete, and the whole building inhales. Doors that won't open for another 23 hours thrum in their frames. The range wakes in pieces. First, the guy who never actually slept, then the one who talks to himself before he talks to anyone else, then the chorus of televisions tuned to different worlds. In a place built to stop time, routine becomes the only way to tell it's moving. On the row, everything important happens quietly. A clipboard changes hands. A count clears. A tray slides through steel with a practiced clink that pretends to be gentle. Most men here have learned how to make a day fit into a small box, a workout you can do in a cell, a book that takes 3 chapters to get going, but uses up an entire afternoon. A letter you rewrite until the paper looks tired. The hour outside, if the weather, the staff, the schedule, and the universe agree, means fresh air measured in chain link and sky, the size of a postcard. Some lift, some pace out exact squares, some tilt their faces up just to remember what warmth feels like on bare skin. The staff measure their own days with a different ruler. They carry keys like wedding rings, constant, heavy, never forgotten. The ones who've been here longest move with a choreography you only learn by repetition, a half-second pause before a latch, a glance at a hinge as if to ask, are we good? They don't talk about morality at roll call. They talk about counts, movements, and making sure everyone goes home with the same number of fingers they arrived with. In a place that holds people for what they did, survival is about what you don't do. You don't get sloppy. You don't make a promise you can't keep. You don't let your face tell the story your mouth can't. There's a superintendent who walks the row every week and insists on calling people by their names. He knows which cells will answer with a joke and which will let silence speak. He's rehearsed 1,000 times what to say on the night when the calendar isn't a theory anymore. How do you explain a process designed to end things? You don't. You supervise it. You keep the temperature steady. You say the same words you said the last time and pray they don't stick to your throat. He's learned to live with the paradox that defines his life. The more humanely the ritual is performed, the more inhuman it can look to people who only ever see it from the outside. And then there's the hour. Everyone knows which one. When the men who aren't going anywhere settle into a stillness that feels heavier than punishment. If an execution is scheduled, the quiet spreads like fog. Nobody says final. That word is too honest. But you can tell by the way televisions run low, by how the rec pen empties earlier, by how the guards' jokes sound preoccupied. The person at the center of it sometimes asks about small things, what time it is, whether the music channels still work, who's on duty tonight. Sometimes he apologizes to the people who have to do their jobs. Sometimes he doesn't say anything at all. The truth is that both sides carry weight. The man in the cell is counting down. The man with the keys is counting steps. They both know the ritual will ask them to be precise, at a moment when everything inside them wants to shake. The uniform says, procedure. The body says, this is a person. It's not a conflict you fix. It's a conflict you live with, one shift at a time. Between those heavy hours, life insists on being ordinary. A barber's chair spins in a little shop that feels like a secret island of normal. A careful hand fades a clean line around an ear, and for 15 minutes the world shrinks to hair, mirror, and approval. In another block, someone tunes a guitar. In the library, a man argues politely, with citations about an essay he says will outlast him. That's the part people miss, not the drama, not the verdicts, but the survival. Dignity here isn't a grand speech, it's sharing a dull pencil. It's handing a book through bars because a guy finished his last chapter at 2 a.m. and can't sleep without a new story. Even kindness is regulated. A cat curls into a warm comma at the edge of a neatly made bunk, and for once it's the rules that allow softness instead of crushing it. A privilege like that has to be earned and kept. Litter changed on time. Vet visits approved. No nonsense. It sounds small to anyone who's never stared at the same wall for years, but that small purring weight can drag a man back from the ledge edge of hopelessness. It reminds him there's one thing in the world that doesn't care what his worst minute looked like, only whether he's steady, gentle, on schedule. In a place where power is the air you breathe, caring for something fragile is the closest thing to power most men will ever hold again. Not every day is uneventful. A whispered insult turns into a stare that turns into a bang on steel that turns into a lockdown. When the tears go dark and the range falls silent, all the missing pieces of people's lives return at once. Appointments they can't make, phone calls they can't place, hospital updates they can't get. A man folds his hands and tries not to think of a mother he can't call anymore. Another sits at his bars and stares down the line as if the right shape of silence might carry him home. You can tell who's done time by how they behave when nothing can be done. The veterans go small, let the moment pass through them. Count the seconds like beads. The new guys huff against it and learn the long way that time always wins. Letters do a different kind of winning. No email can do what paper does here. Hold the weight of a hand, an imperfect loop of ink, a coffee stain from a kitchen far away. Some envelopes arrive fat, birth announcements, clippings, a drawing from a kid who doesn't know what unit means. Others are thin and decisive. The worst ones are short. I can't keep doing this. Doors don't slam in here, they rust shut slowly. People on the outside move on because that's what the outside does. People on the inside learn how to say goodbye to folks who aren't actually gone. They're just busy surviving a different kind of life. You'd think all this routine would grind people down to sameness. It doesn't. It distills. The loudest learn when to whisper. The angriest learn when to breathe. The most broken find cracks where light can still land. There's a man who writes poetry and pretends he isn't a poet. There's another who keeps 3 books going at once, because switching lanes makes the miles easier. There's the old-timer who knows every staffer's first name and says hello like a benediction. He's been here longer than some of them have been alive. He remembers a different set of rules, a different death chamber, a different head count, and he'll tell you about it if you let him. Food is the one argument you can start in any cell, any day. Everybody has an opinion and all of them are right. Tuesday stew wasn't built for fans. The coffee is proof that optimism still lives behind these walls. You drink it because you believe it might work today. When a holiday lands, the trays look a shade more generous and the building gets briefly, weirdly sentimental. Even the hardest men soften a little when a cookie shows up where a cookie usually does. Now and then, someone new arrives and the balance tilts. Youth has a specific sound: too fast, too proud, too sure. The veterans clock it from a mile away. They know how long it takes for the reality to sink in, that no one is coming to turn the key by accident. That appeals are calendars disguised as hope, that the smartest thing you can do here is stay small and keep your word. The row is a teacher with a brutal syllabus: pass, fail, everyone learn. There's also the day when the legal machine coughs up an answer nobody planned for. A sentence changes, a date disappears. A life that was supposed to end on a certain night gets rerouted into forever. On paper, that looks like mercy. In a cell, it looks like a new map with the same horizon. The relief is real, so is the whiplash. You can't plan for tomorrow when tomorrow used to be a wall you could see, touch, count down to. Men who have rehearsed their last hour learn how to rehearse their next decade. That's a different kind of heart. All of this, the ritual and the ordinary, the countdown and the cat purring through lockdown, exists inside a building that most people only imagine in 2 colors, black and white. The longer you stay, the more gray you see. Not the weak kind of gray that ducks decisions. The honest kind that admits people are complicated, that choices have shadows, that justice without humility curdles into something mean. So, why does the place feel alive when it's designed for endings? Because against every wall, something pushes back. A letter gets answered. A haircut looks sharp, a joke lands exactly right, and 3 cells laugh at once. A guard nods because a man kept his cool. A superintendent chooses words that won't ignite a fuse. A cat closes her eyes and trusts a hand that shakes a little less this week than it did last week. Life finds edges to cling to. It always does. And if you're still certain, absolutely certain about what should happen to every man here, stay with me. Names matter. Histories matter. The monsters you hear about on the internet also wrote to sisters, lost mothers, learned a skill, or folded under a pressure you've never had to hold. That doesn't excuse the harm they caused, it just refuses to flatten them into slogans. Justice fails when it forgets how to listen. Because the story isn't a hallway, or a gurney, or even a countdown. The story is people, the ones who made unforgivable decisions, the ones who survived those decisions, the ones tasked with carrying out a law they didn't write, the ones who keep breathing inside a life that will never be free again. If you want to understand this world, you need faces, not headlines. You need the stubborn details no one can package neatly. And that brings us to the next chapter, the names you've only heard in whispers. The lifer who learned how to steady his hands with a pair of clippers. The man whose sentence collapsed into another kind of forever. The quiet inmate who swears a small animal saved his sanity. In part 3, we stop talking about inmates and start talking about people, how they broke, how they're piecing together what's left, and how a system built for endings keeps inventing new middles. Step past the headlines, and suddenly, the prison isn't just concrete and rules, it's a collection of lives that can't be summarized in a single sentence. Each man is a story, and the strangest part is how ordinary some of those stories sound, right up until they don't. Take the barber. His name doesn't make newspapers, and he'll never leave the walls that surround him, but his chair has been a place of quiet trust for years. Guards, lifers, even men on the row have sat down in front of him. Clippers buzz, hair falls, and for 15 minutes the world stops being defined by crimes or sentences. It becomes a transaction everyone recognizes. One person takes care of another. The man who learned to fade and line up hair talks about it like a calling. He says he ruined lives once, so now he'll spend the rest of his life making small things right. It isn't redemption in the Hollywood sense. It's steadiness. And in a place where everyone's past screams louder than their present, that steadiness feels almost radical. Then there's the inmate who swears he owes his survival to a creature that never judged him. The prison's cat program isn't a rumor, it's real. Well-behaved inmates can apply for the privilege of keeping a cat in their cell. On the outside, that might sound like a small comfort. In here, it's seismic. Imagine being locked away for decades, then coming home to a tiny heartbeat that doesn't know about your past. One man said he raised his cat since she was the size of his palm, that she meows when he comes back from chow like he's been gone for hours instead of minutes. He calls her his kid. When lockdowns drag on for days, he swears she keeps him sane. For him, compassion has fur and claws and a stubborn way of reminding him that he still matters to something alive. But not every story bends toward warmth. Some tilt into tragedy, even after the sentence has been handed down. That's where Frederick Bear comes in. His name surfaced in the mid-2000s for reasons that froze people's blood. A mother, a 4-year-old daughter, a crime so brutal that even veteran prosecutors struggled to describe it in court. He confessed in interviews, sometimes flat, sometimes rambling, sometimes with tears he swore were real. He admitted he deserved death, said it plain, without drama, and for years, that's exactly what his future looked like. Execution in Indiana's death house. But then the legal machine did what it sometimes does. It jammed, reversed, and rerouted. In 2019, Bear's death sentence was overturned on appeal. He wasn't walking free, he never will, but his date with the gurney was erased. Instead, he was resentenced to life behind bars. For the families of his victims, that ruling was another wound. The finality they braced for evaporated. For Bear, it was a strange kind of reprieve. The removal of one horizon and its replacement with another. "I'll probably die here anyway," he admitted, "but maybe not by the state's hand." That whiplash between certainty and uncertainty isn't rare. Appeals stretch for years, sometimes decades. One inmate marked off birthdays of the people he killed on a calendar, as if acknowledging them could balance what he did. Another kept stacks of court paperwork in his cell, thick as bricks, proof that the system hadn't quite decided what to do with him yet. Hope and dread exist side by side, indistinguishable until the next ruling arrive. It would be easy to reduce every man here to the worst thing he ever did. And yes, many of those things are unspeakable. But the truth is that people don't stop being people after sentencing. They grieve. They argue about food. They write letters to girlfriends who may or may not write back. They fold paper into shapes to pass the time. They cry when mothers die and they can't attend funerals. They tell jokes to hide the fact that they're terrified of being forgotten. And sometimes they tell the truth so plainly it makes you flinch. I did it. I deserve what's coming. I don't expect forgiveness. The honesty is jagged. It cuts both ways. It horrifies because it leaves no room for doubt. It haunts because it shows a level of self-awareness you weren't expecting. Names like Wrinkles, Bear, Corcoran, they've all become symbols in Indiana's long, uneasy relationship with the death penalty. But behind each symbol is a man who wakes up, eats breakfast off a tray, and wonders how many more mornings he'll see. Behind each case file is a voice that cracks when it talks about family or steadies when it talks about guilt. These aren't excuses, they're dimensions, and ignoring them makes the picture simpler than reality deserves to be. Because here's the thing, prisons don't just hold men, they hold contradictions. The barber who cuts hair with precision once cut short 2 lives. The man who cuddles a cat to keep his heart beating once shattered other hearts beyond repair. The inmate who swears he'll never be anything but a thief was once a child stealing toy cars, and now he's middle-aged, still waiting for the day the system decides how much theft of time he'll endure. It's messy, it's disturbing, it's human, and that's exactly why this place forces everyone, guards, inmates, journalists, and viewers like us, to sit with questions we'd rather push aside. And those questions only sharpen when the law itself shifts. Because while the men inside try to cope with routines and reversals, the state outside has its own decisions to make. Indiana once seemed to leave executions behind. But then the clock restarted. In part 4, we face the hardest truth of all, what happens when the system decides to kill again, and what it means for every life still waiting inside those walls. For 15 years, the death chamber at Indiana State Prison stayed quiet. After Matthew Eric Wrinkles was executed in 2009, the state simply stopped. Partly because of shifting politics, partly because of a shortage of lethal injection drugs, partly because public attention drifted elsewhere. To the men waiting, that silence was everything. Some believed it meant mercy. Others called it a delay disguised as hope. Families of victims wondered if the state had abandoned its own promises. Guards went about their routines, uncertain if the room at the end of the hall was still part of their job or just a relic. But silence doesn't last forever. In December 2024, Indiana restarted executions with Joseph Corcoran, a man convicted of killing 4 people in Fort Wayne back in 1997. The date was set, the process rehearsed, the drugs prepared. For the first time in a decade and a half, the ritual wasn't just a memory, it was real. Witnesses filed into the chamber. The superintendent did his duty. Corcoran's story ended on schedule. The message was clear. Indiana's death penalty wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. For inmates, that restart was a thunderclap. Men who thought their appeals might outlast the system had to recheck their calendars. The countdown wasn't abstract anymore. The state had proven it still had both the will and the means to follow through. Imagine living years with a question mark, only to see it sharpen back into a period. And yet, the uncertainty remains. Because if one case can pause for 15 years, another can shift in an instant. Bear's sentence once promised death. Now it promises decades of life behind walls. Wrinkles never made it to an appeal that could save him. Corcoran waited nearly 3 decades before his final walk. Justice here isn't swift. It's slow, grinding, unpredictable. And that unpredictability is its own kind of torment for inmates, for families of victims, even for the people who have to enforce it. The ethical clash is impossible to escape. Supporters of capital punishment point to closure, deterrence, and retribution. They say some crimes are so monstrous that nothing short of execution matches the weight of the harm done. Opponents argue that the system makes mistakes, that mercy defines a society more than punishment, that life without parole is already a slow-motion death sentence. Inside the walls, those arguments aren't theory, they're lived experience. A man may believe he deserves the needle and still feel fear as the date approaches. A guard may believe in justice and still ask his pastor for forgiveness after performing it. Even outside, the divide runs deep. When Wrinkles was executed, protesters gathered outside the prison, candles in hand, some chanting for abolition, others shouting for justice. When Corcoran's time came in 2024, the same scene played out again, almost like history on repeat. Two groups, standing in the same cold air, united only by the fact that they believe the stakes are life and death, and they're both right, depending on how you measure it. What lingers is the humanity no law can erase. A man on the road talks about his cat as if she's his child. Another holds on to letters from a girlfriend thousands of miles away. A barber perfects his fades as if they're masterpieces. They are criminals, yes. Some of them guilty of horrors that make your blood turn cold. But they are also men who laugh, cry, fear, hope, and remember. And the state of Indiana holds the power to decide when that humanity stops breathing. So here's the question that echoes long after you turn away from these stories. What is justice supposed to feel like? Should it feel final, like a locked door and a silent gurney? Should it feel endless, like a sentence that stretches across decades until the body gives out on its own? Or should it feel like something we haven't quite figured out yet, because we're still caught between anger and mercy, between procedure and conscience? Indiana's prison doesn't offer answers. It offers a mirror. Some see closure, some see cruelty, some see both at the same time. But one thing is certain. The walk from the holding cell to the gurney isn't just a prisoner's journey, it's a reflection of all of us, of what we choose to call justice, and of how willing we are to live with the consequences. And maybe that's the hardest truth to sit with. In the end, executions don't just end lives, they test our own humanity.